All right, today we're going to talk about imperialism. If you look at the word imperialism, it really, the root is empire. And this is going to be an era where countries are trying to establish or create empires or expand their empires for natural resources. And they have a sense of nationalism, which has pushed them into imperialism. So, our essential question today is how can imperialism be the underlying cause of war? When you have countries taking over other areas, it can cause warfare and strife due to the people not wanting to be oppressed by the more powerful group. So, there's your essential question. So, when we talk about imperialism, what is imperialism? Imperialism is a policy of extending power and domination over another country or territory. Why do people do it? They want natural resources. There's something that that country has that they want or desire. Owning other countries and territories makes a country more powerful. So I'll give you two examples of imperialism. You need to make sure you write all this stuff down. The United States annexes, which annex means that you say that it's part of you, or you say you're part of us now. So the U.S. annexes Hawaii to use Hawaii as a fueling station in the South Pacific for our ships. So we take Hawaii. There was a queen there, and we took it over and said, "This, you guys belong to us now." Or the British taking over India and parts of Asia to control the tea trade. So what you have to look at is both motives are benefiting the larger, more powerful country. So when you look at this map's from 1900, and if you look, you can look at the key and see Great Britain is a light green here, and the United States is a gray. And if you look, Japan and other countries, European countries, the United States and Japan were the imperialistic powers during this time. So they took over lots of areas. So if you look, you can look at South America was imperialized. Africa was just about completely imperialized except for Ethiopia remained independent. And then you can see Australia and Southeast Asia as well. So what or how do we set the stage for imperialism? What you have to understand is that there's new technologies, gunboats, rifles, machine guns, and exploding shells. When Europe and even the United States advance in their technology, then they're able to take over other countries that don't necessarily may not have the weapons or don't have as many weapons. Like African countries had machine guns, but by the 1800s, the British and other European countries had more machine guns than the African countries and tribes. So they overpowered them. So, how does this new technology help imperialism? It allows domination of countries without new technology, or the country did not have enough technology to maintain control. So, give you an example here. You need to make sure you put this in your notes. India sends raw materials to England and purchases the finished goods from England. England takes the raw materials and makes them into finished goods, and then sends the finished goods to sale in the Indian market. So, who's benefiting the most? England. Okay? Now, when we talk about India and the British in India, there was a British East India Company. It was a trading company. They controlled trade between Great Britain, India, and most of Southeast Asia. And their trade, the big market was tea, but there were other markets as well, like spice trade. They ultimately, the British started to manipulate the rulers in the small Indian states because they were kind of broken up into states to keep India in chaos. And so once they started this conflict and this chaos amongst these Indian governors, the British East India Company brought in armies, and they were like, "Oh, we're bringing our armies to help with this chaos and this conflict that you guys have." So the first check for understanding, you need to make sure you put these in your notes because I'm going to check them for a grade, is how does this manipulation affect the Indians? You know, the British started this chaos, and then they're going to say, "Hey, we'll come in and help you with this." So take a note, take a second, and make sure you do your check for understanding. The next thing is, and the question is, what were the changes in India under British rule? So when the British came in, they set up a new education system. They told the Indians they had to speak the English language. They banned certain Hindu practices, and they brought in Christian missionaries, which means that they were pushing out their traditional religions of Hinduism and Islam and bringing in Christian missionaries. This is going to lead to conflict. Why do you think it's going to lead to conflict? New language, new education system, making them dress differently. They can't can't practice their religion the way they have for thousands of years. Remember, Hinduism is the oldest religion. Now, there will be a mutiny. The Sepoy Mutiny. So sepoys are, and I'm going to zoom over here. Sepoys are an Indian soldier, and they serve under British or other European orders. Okay, so they serve under the British Army, not necessarily by choice. I mean, some of them did choose to, and they felt some strife from other Indians. But in 1857, there were strained relations, and it forced the sepoys and the British soldiers to have an altercation and a rebellion. Um, Here was the cause. They had a new rifle. Rifle was awesome. But soldiers had to bite off a cartridge before they could insert the cartridge, there was like a cap on the cartridge before they put it in the gun. Here's the problem. The cartridge was greased with pork and beef fat. If you know anything about Hindus and Muslims, which predominantly during this time Indians were Hindu or Muslim, they don't eat pork and they don't eat beef. So this goes exactly against their religion, which causes them to fight. So one thing I wanted to point out with this image is these are the sepoys, and they're wearing European-looking uniforms while still having that, traditional look of their turbans. And so when you look over here at this image, you can see them with the rifles and some of the traditional wear of Europeans, but still honoring their turban and their culture there. Now, here's your second check for understanding. I want you to take a look at this political cartoon. What is the meaning? What symbols do you see? And so when you take a look, it says the clemency of Canning, and at the bottom it says, well then, they shan't slow him from nasty guns, but he must promise to be a good little sepoy. So I want you to think about this representation of this sepoy and this European here in the political cartoon. Take some time, tell me what symbols you see and what you think the meaning is. Now, what were the effects of the mutiny? Pretty much, there were lots of atrocities. So when we talk about atrocities, atrocities are crimes like manipulation, killing of people, harm, devastation, gruesome crimes, brutally committed by both sides. In 1858, the British East India Trading Company no longer controlled India. They just let Great Britain completely come in and take over India. Okay, so if you look here at this map, it'll show you Britain's touch and where they were involved all over the world. These are all their trade routes, okay, from the 1700 to 1800. So the British were in India when you look 1767, 1858. So if you look, you can see the purple, the dark pink, and then the light pink and how they expanded. And then the blue lines are where you can see the Sepoy Mutiny occurred in India, which is really in the heart of India if you look right here. But this slow spread over time. Now, the Raj is an era of British rule in India. What you have to understand is that the reason that Britain felt like they could take over India is because they felt like the Indians were less than them. So we use the word inferior, and that they were like savages or incapable of ruling themselves. We know now, and we know in world history that that's not necessarily true. All areas have the 5 key traits of civilization. So the Indians had to live in separate neighborhoods and had limited rights. So what's interesting about this is that this is their land, their original land, and they are forced off and told they had to live in separate neighborhoods. Now the British improved, the Indians' infrastructure, as in their buildings and their city grids and all that kind of stuff, because they brought in railroads and canals, which help you trade better. Flag here, map here. All right, and then how did the Raj change India? So India ended up being the biggest market for British goods. They had raw materials such as like cotton, indigo, tea, jute, and India became Great Britain's biggest resource for cotton because during the Civil War, the South's economy was kind of decimated and destroyed, so we weren't producing cotton, but they could grow it in India, and India could import goods cheaper than India could make them. So instead of having them make the cabinets in India, they would just send the wood from India to Great Britain. So, a couple of things here. All right, and so how did the Indians try to establish nationalism? The Indian National Congress started to meet in 1885. They organized to fight for Indians' rights, but the problem was, and it's just that they have some internal conflict, is it was mainly made up of Indian Hindus, and they boycotted British goods, which were excellent. But the Indian Muslims formed the Muslim League in 1906, and so they were trying to fight and advocate for nationalism and freedom from Great Britain. But the problem is because they had 2 separate groups, that makes the movement in general look divided. And so they had conflict because of their religious views, being Hindu and Muslim, but both were fighting for the same cause, but due to their religious beliefs and ideals, they could not get it together. And so it'll be a while before India gets their freedom, and we will talk about that in the next unit. Make sure that you've written all your notes down, your essential question, your question stems, and your check for understandings.